Chapter 9 is called Unwelcome Attention. The members of the ARC project had put in place several measures to limit the chances of their identities being revealed, in what in retrospect was a mission carried out in plain sight. Clear instructions had been given to Mr. Hargreaves to not include any of their real names or photographs in his article. That was all fine. When the article was printed later that day, none of their identities were revealed. The children had also thought very carefully about where they would be sitting and how visible they would be to the children outside the bakery. They knew that the Drumhall boys would inevitably see Kazima by the door, but the bakery counter would obscure them from the Elmswood pupils queued by the shop window. There was one connection, however, that they had failed to properly account for. Mr. and Mrs. Brackett, and Mr. Brackett's before them, had been supplying meat to the Fleck for decades. Twice a week, straight after the lunchtime rush, Miss Fleck would visit the butcher's shop to collect all the fillings she would need for her pies and pastries. She would wait while her orders were being bagged up and compare their shop to her own. Unlike the bakery, the walls and shelves in the Brackett shop were free of awards, certificates, and printed reviews. They simply had a laminated price list, which had been taped to the white tile wall, and a magnetic strip which held an extensive selection of knives. Sitting on top of the till in the far corner of the shop was one final item: a framed school photograph of a boy Miss Fleck assumed was the Brackett's son. Miss Fleck had been due to collect her meat order on the day of the sit-in. Once all the fuss had died down, she went round to the Brackett shop as usual, still reeling from what had occurred earlier that day. "Good afternoon, Edna," greeted the rosy-cheeked Mrs. Brackett, every bit as cheerfully as would be expected from her son. "It'll be me doing your orders today. Albert's down at the vet's with Brutus. The poor thing's taken very unwell." If Mrs. Brackett had been expecting kind or sympathetic words from Miss Fleck, she certainly wasn't going to get them. "From this afternoon onwards, I will be severing all trades with your business," Miss Fleck announced, ignoring the news about Brutus altogether. "Your son and his friends put on quite the performance in my shop today and lost me a great deal of money as a result. I have no interest at all in doing business with anybody who would raise such a pathetically useless child." "I beg your pardon," bellowed Mrs. Brackett. You see, sometimes nice, cheerful people get angry too, and when they do, it's best to get as far away as quickly as possible. Most people let their anger trickle out quite often. They regularly get it out of their system, and it's never that scary. When nice people get angry, though, the floodgates burst open with an almighty crash. The blood rushes to their heads with such speed and ferocity that you can see the veins in their necks pulsating. They can yell so loud that entire flocks of birds will feel the tremors from miles away, fleeing their trees suddenly in fright. Miss Fleck felt the full force of Mrs. Brackett's anger that afternoon. She practically jumped out of her skin with shock. "Get out of my shop right now and never come back," Mrs. Brackett exploded, prompting Miss Fleck to speed back to her bakery without another word. His parents' arguing kept Chris awake most of the night. Mr. Brackett had got home late with Brutus, who after several tests was discovered to have blood poisoning. The vet reckoned he'd come into contact with pest control bait at some point. Even though he'd been told that his dog was going to be okay with the correct treatment, Mr. Brackett clearly looked exhausted after what had been a very long day. Amy had already been sent up to bed. It was just Chris and his mum who were still up to greet Albert when he finally got home. After they'd given him a chance to grab a coffee and a quick bite to eat, Chris was asked to tell his father what had happened in Miss Fleck's shop earlier that day. Once he'd finished listening to what Chris had to say, Mr. Brackett sat in silence, quite expressionless. That was always a very bad sign. The quiet before the storm. "Go to bed," he said to Chris in a whispered voice, avoiding eye contact. "We'll deal with this in the morning." The yelling started the moment Chris's bedroom door was closed. He wasn't used to hearing his parents arguing like this. Mrs. Brackett had told her husband about the confrontation with Miss Fleck, the horrible things she'd said about their son, and how they were no longer in business with one another. "I can't believe you could do something so stupid, Albert said to his wife. You know that the bakery is one of our biggest accounts. How do you expect us to keep afloat without Edna's orders? Especially now after Brutus's colossal vet bills. The savings are gone. We have nothing to spare. Mrs. Brackett sounded tearful. Some things are more important than money, Albert, she said. Chris might not always make the best choices, but he is our son. He always comes first, no matter what. The room went silent as Mr. Brackett digested his wife's words. I just don't know what we're going to do, he eventually said, sounding calmer but no less deflated. Mr. and Mrs. Brackett were by no means the only people to find out the identities of the culprits. The next day at Miss Fleck's bakery, despite the damning newspaper article exposing her unfair queuing system, it was business as usual. All ARC project members decided to keep a low profile at lunchtime and avoided the bakery altogether. When the rest of the customers from the two schools turned up, though, they were surprised to find Miss Fleck waiting outside her shop to greet them. She stood blocking the door to her shop and continued to do so for a few minutes until quite a large crowd of children had time to arrive. It's been brought to my attention, she finally said, that some of you feel that my queuing system is rather unfair, and I have therefore decided to make some changes. From now on, everybody queues. Outraged shouts and protests came from both schools. You can all thank that Brackett boy and those friends of his. Now, I need a line from each school. The smartest shall get to enter first. There was a murmur of noise and a rustle of jackets as the children got themselves organised. Drumhall, you shall enter first. The first four of you, let's go. The clever, spiteful Miss Fleck had thought of a way for the Elmswood children to be made to wait even longer. For of course the Drumhall boys were always going to be chosen first, and the amount of time it took for Miss Fleck to make a big show out of who she was going to pick just meant more time wasted. The children would be lucky if they get fed at all by the end of their lunch break. Kazima, Chris, Trevor and David had no clue about the changes that Miss Fleck had put in place, or of the fact that she had revealed Chris's involvement. They were about to find out, though, as they waited to go into Mr. Torrance's English class. Brilliant stunt at the bakery yesterday, Chris Packet, snarled Becky, swaggering threateningly over to Chris until she was just inches away from him. Were you trying to keep the rest of us out so you could have all the pies to yourself? Oh, and I bet your little geek squad over there were there too. At this point, she turned and raised her voice so that everybody would hear. I saw them all smooching behind the boiler room just before it happened. Oh, is that a fact? Chipped in Mr. Torrance, who of course happened to be walking back to his room with his cup of coffee at that exact second. I didn't realise you were all so close. I'll tell you what I'll do. Let me fix up the room a little so you can all be a little closer. And that's exactly what he did. Desks were shifted so that there was a little row of four smack bang at the front of the class. David's throne was dragged over, and Kazima and Trevor were told to move from their places near the back of the room. So there they sat, the four of them. Trevor was initially quite relieved to be further away from Becky. But whilst the frequency of her kicks and insults lessened, the humiliation they all faced at the hands of Mr. Torrance increased tenfold. It truly was relentless. It seemed that virtually everything their teacher said would somehow find a way of targeting one of the four of them. It was probably hardest for Kazima, who'd escaped the worst of Mr. Torrance's treatment up until that point. She was never comfortable being the centre of attention at the best of times, and when people were looking and laughing at her after Mr. Torrance had slagged off her hair or called her Kiss Zima, it made her feel sick. Mr. Torrance, with Becky and the rest of the class, of course, all knew that the kissing talk was nonsense. The worrying thing was that they had all correctly worked out that they were responsible for the bakery sit-in, and if anything similar was to occur in the near future, they'd be the prime suspects. When the class was finally over and the rest of the children had disappeared, the ARC members lingered behind. Emergency meeting, tonight at 5, Kazima whispered before walking away. Everybody nodded in agreement. They made their way to their next classes. Little did any of them know that further down the corridor and round the corner, Becky O'Hara had waited behind with listening ears. And that's us. I will be back probably tomorrow with chapter 10. Thank you for listening. Bye.